for the ones who had been participating, for example, with this journalists forum we had been doing. I think it's very, very helpful that we do this educational part for media and for science journalists in general. So I would recommend that we approve the budget. Is that okay for you? Then this is taken. Then we want the ENG2 Special Committee is organizing a hearing on climate change disinformation on the 12th of January. That will be tentatively held between 9:45 in the morning and 11:15. There are two experts invited and already confirmed. That's Jenny King and John Rosenbeck. You must have had that in your papers, the CVs. So the chair would invite STOA to be associated to the hearing. STOA members would be invited to participate and take the floor in this STOA meeting and this hearing. If STOA members agree, the Secretariat will process on that basis. I think that is a good exercise that we are now invited from time to time to hearings which are affecting our work or vice versa. And for the ones who are interested, you have that in your preparation for the meetings. It's on the 12th of January, and I would recommend to go there because I think it's very much related to the climate change disinformation campaigns are very much related to our work, especially also to the Science Media Hub, and we had been substantially contributing, also having an overview on issues like that and how they are conducted in social media. So, sorry. So I would really invite members to participate. Okay, that is in practical terms what we would have to decide. So formally, I have to inform you that it's a hybrid meeting. It's the members, the interpretation is available in English, French, and German, so formal things. But I just would like you to know that if there are no requests and changes, addition, the agenda is adopted. You saw the draft minutes of the STOA panel meeting of the 15th. You have read that carefully. I haven't heard that there are any comments on that, so I see that as taken. So in practical terms, that leaves us with...
We have the decisions taken. You can jump to the presentation.
Yeah.
People want to suggest.
So, since we have a presentation today, are there any comments? I was rushing a little bit to the agenda because we have two presentations. So, but if there is anything you want to bring up, I don't see that. Lina.
Yeah, sorry, I was late because I was in our working group. I had to escape, and then I couldn't find the room. Sorry about that. Anyway, just I don't know if you have been going through the deadline for new proposals or how. I mean, because we have a list of proposals here, but I don't know if it is open or do we have a deadline or something? So it's just sorry because I missed the very beginning of the session.
No.
And
we just decided on the ones which had been brought forward and with the recommendation of the board and the secretariat, the panel had been deciding to do them. So if there is anything new, then we go ahead.
Just, no, I will then.
And you shouldn't say that in politics, but we have enough money. So
I imagine.
Okay. Yeah. Just if you. No. But I mean, it's would be good. I mean, if someone wants to bring something forward, it would be good to do that before Christmas because it will take some time. Our next meeting is, I think, in the end of January, if I'm not wrong. So it would be helpful just for new proposals to send that to us before Christmas. But everything you send after Christmas is also fine. But then I think we start working on the 9th of January, and the next meeting is then in the end of January, if I'm not wrong. Okay, so the update on the STOA publications. Okay, then we can jump to point 5 if you don't have any questions, and that would be the presentation of the report of the Commission's Chief Science Advisors, SAPEA, if I get the acronym right, and EGE on strategic crisis management in Europe. The presentation had been offered to STOA by the Commission's Chief Science Advisors, SAPEA, the Science Advice for Policy by the European Academies, and the European Group on Ethics in Science and New Technologies, EG, to jointly present their recent report on the strategic crisis management in Europe. The STOA Bureau agreed this is a timely moment to present this report and to allow for a decision. So, actually, the presentation of the evidence report will be done by Professor Tina Gomez, leader of the working group of SAPEA Science Advice for Policy by the European Academies. And then we have a second presentation of the scientific opinion on strategic crisis management by Professor Maarja Kruusma. She's a member of the group of the Chief Scientific Advisors to the European Commission also. And then there is a third presentation, or presentation of the statement, Values in Time of the Crisis, Strategic Crisis Management in the EU, by Professor Barbara Prainsack, the European Groups of Ethics in Science and New Technologies, EGE. So I think we can start. Yes, I'm looking to the screen. Are you online, Professor Gomez? I hope so. Usually someone is saying, please press the button.
Yes, I am. But I couldn't, I was all black.
Wonderful. Welcome. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for the invitation. And indeed, it is a great privilege to present to this panel today on behalf of the whole working group, indeed a complicated acronym, but Science Advice for Policy by the European Academies, our evidence review report on strategic management of crisis in the EU. What we did in our part of this whole work is we reviewed the literature on strategic crisis management, which is an incredibly broad topic. So we covered a very broad spectrum of questions that ranged from crisis governance and law to trust and inequality. But also, of course, most relevant for you, the use of technology and data, and how can we use that, for instance, to improve participation. Because, as you know, the EU has been confronted with many crises and will be confronted with more. What we try to do in our review report is distill generic principles of strategic crisis management from the literature, and then also interlace it with a couple of cases. And the first point that I would like to make is that this evidence shows that the nature of crisis is changing. We've, of course, all witnessed the pandemic. We see the climate crisis worsen. We see the war in Ukraine, inflation, energy crisis. And we see the nature of these crises is different from what we are traditionally used to, like firefighting, wildfires, or dealing with earthquakes and so forth. And that is because these crises are much more complex. They cross borders of member states, and they influence all areas of our societies. These crises are transboundaries, and you have the effect that then they are also amplifying each other. That means that there is no region, sector that is unaffected by these many cascading effects. So that is the complexity. And at the same time, of course, we are talking about crisis. So time is of the essence. Crises push us to urgently react to these very, very complex problems. And moreover, the decisions that we make in crisis, and definitely the strategic decisions of these huge mega crises that we are confronted with, they will have long-lasting implications. Implications for economic prosperity, implications for growth, for equality or inequality, and societal stability. So that means that the tools we use for firefighting and so forth, they are, of course, not designed to handle and tackle these questions. We also need to recognize that the response to one crisis will create amplifying risks for other sectors or crises. And we suggest that, therefore, risk and crisis management need to be thought closer together. And of course, risk management has many, many tools and approaches that can and have been used and that are also there. But what we also see is that our conventional risk management approaches is very much based on assets and approaches that focus on direct losses or predicting the hazard itself better. And that is, of course, a cornerstone of any sort of crisis management, but it does not capture the many indirect economic, social, distributional effects. And therefore, we say that there is a gap on considering societal welfare instead of these direct losses or hazards that we are modeling. And to complement that, there is an opportunity to introduce and focus also on resilience. That is, of course, a buzzword that we might say has many facets and many more definitions. But in a nutshell, this is about the rapid recovery from crisis to get on a better developmental path. And we know that there are several principles that are known to foster resilience that ranges from increasing buffer capacity, very technically, and robustness, to increasing response diversity, flexibility, and planning for self-organization and considering these distributive effects that I was talking about. Now, we often hear that something that resilience will pay off. And this resilience is expensive, obviously also depends on the underlying assumptions and scenarios. Okay, so I've covered urgency, complexity, and these long-lasting entangled crises that pose a lot of challenges. But so you will know that over the past decades, Europe, but also science and research, have developed a broad range of technologies and tools that we also highlight in the evidence review. We do have more data and information than ever before. Currently, there are many, artificial intelligence tools, dashboards, indicators, models, but they are often based on very diverse data sets or varying assumptions. What we can do is we can improve monitoring and reporting standards across sectors and member states, including clear signposts, triggering mechanisms, and bring the evidence that we have better together. We can also use advanced simulation and modeling tools to improve strategic foresight and scenario analysis even further, covering also a broader spectrum of sectors. Technology also has a role to play in training. We see that conventional trainings and simulations, that is, exercises bringing many people together, are very heavy and often focused on professional responders. Now, we don't suggest bringing, all of you to a huge one-week training exercise, but we also say that we can use technology, augmented and virtual reality or serious gaming, for instance, for training of decision makers at all levels. And then I'm also talking something like micro-trainings. Then we often hear that we cannot predict crisis. And certainly we can't predict everything, but we can make better informed guesses about what will be needed in a response. We can, for instance, invest in data preparedness to agree before a crisis occurs what information will be needed, where it can be acquired, or how it will be shared. And we can establish strong knowledge networks that facilitate ad hoc deployment of expertise and scientific capacity to contribute to a better strategic crisis management in Europe. Thanks so much once more for this opportunity. And with this, I hand over to Maarja, I think.
So again, my voice to Mrs. Kruusma, please press the button.
Good morning, European Parliament, and many greetings from the snowy Estonia. Actually, it's snowed in Estonia. We have an ongoing crisis and the islands are without electricity for 10 days already. So let's do some crisis management for a beginning. I'm snowed in my house and my car is blocking the drive. And if you hear the doorbell, I have to go because it's snowplow that comes to help me out. And it will be Professor Tina Comas that takes over from
Don't
her.
worry, every understanding for individual emergencies.
Thank you.
It's a part of crisis management.
Exactly. But that was a very trivial risk management, actually. We all can handle that. So we will explain more what's the difference between risk and resilience management in a minute. I'll get back to that. But in essence, what Tina Comas' evidence shows is that the nature of the risks is changing. And therefore, we recommend that the way we handle the crisis needs to change too. Because the old way of handling the crisis where you had a luxury of dealing with one crisis at a time is not here anymore. Or as one commission officer put it, if you have only a crisis only in one sector, it's not a crisis. It's just a trivial situation. We can handle that. And why does it connect it to technology and technology assessment? Because very many of those risks that Tina was referring to, complexity, fast escalations, polar crisis, is actually to a great extent caused by technology. Technology makes us to live in a world which is very interconnected and where information and all sort of effects travel very, very rapidly. You launch a cyber attack in Amsterdam and you see the effects in Senegal. And we have to live with that and we have to be prepared for that because technology is there to stay. We can assess, we can regulate it to some extent, but we also have to be ready and we have to respond. So if the crisis gets cross-sectorial, then the crisis management sectorial, it doesn't work either. Historically, governmental institutions are built up hierarchically, but this is very inflexible and this is too slow for the modern days crisis. And therefore, the scientific advisors recommend, based on the evidence, to introduce more horizontal mechanisms to bridge the silos of crisis management. We also give an example of ERCC in European Commissions that is proven to be one of those horizontal platforms or hubs where crisis management can be done holistically. That has already proven itself in a COVID crisis, and even more with the Russian invasion to Ukraine. It completely again managed to reinvent itself and actually to respond to the new crisis most of us couldn't oversee incredibly fast. So we need more of this time of horizontal mechanism and knowledge hubs to prepare for that, for the new reality. We started writing the scientific opinions 1.5 years ago, and we had a meeting with Commissioner Lenarčič, who asked us that, tell me, with the crisis management, how much we have to centralize or decentralize? What is the best way of crisis management? And Tina was looking at the evidence for 1.5 years, and we were going through it to build the recommendations. And I would say that the hierarchical command lines are too slow, and that rather calls for decentralization. But on the other hand, decentralization does not mean a self-organizing system where every unit, and by unit it could be like a region or a member state or a community or an individual, anything, they do what they want, because this is what we saw in the first week of COVID, when everybody's seeking for their own self-interest, since the overall gain is not necessarily the best. So the best way of handling crisis, in my opinion, in our opinion, is to have quite independent autonomous units, but which are very well coordinated but still have a high degree of autonomy, and where you also will allow the diversity of response. Why do you need the diversity of response? Because it helps the systems to develop. If there's a great restriction, big restriction in Italy during the COVID to keep 2 meters distance, then Estonians were lamenting, why do we have to come so close to each other? Different places are different, and diversity response would help us. But it's also very important to have enough knowledge to understand the uncertainties. Data management is a big technological challenge anyway. Data interoperability, data complexity, we have to handle all the time. We have wonderful instruments already developed by Europe. Copernicus gives us 12 terabytes data per day. But this is just data, right? We need to get also information out of data. And in the days of crisis, we need to get this information fast. So all those mechanisms that help us to get enough data very fast. And it's not just data, it's explainable, easily understandable, easily explainable data. Because when it comes to decision making, in a so-called war room, you have to make your decisions very fast. And those decisions are still based on uncertain data. And decision makers don't have a cognitive capacity to go through Excel files with 200 columns. They need to get the data in an explainable format. This is the first thing. And second, they need to be aware of the uncertainties. Yes, you get data about flood victims, but you also need to get how certain is this data? How much could it increase or decrease in time? And the decision maker might have different decisions based on how reliable her data was. So we recommend always with data to have the estimates on uncertainty and to deliver the data as explainably as possible. Technology is also very important when it comes to resilience assessment and long-term assessment, what Tina Gomez was saying about, because it's all about modeling. Modeling all relies on data, and modeling takes a lot of computational power. So we have to have those mechanisms in place that gives us long-term assessment of the effects. They could be very complex models and they could be uncertain models, but we still need those models, and they're often better than just our guesses. Thank you very much. The snowblow hasn't came yet, but I would still like to give a floor over here to the next speaker.
Thank you, and we wish you all the best with the slow blower. And I think your colleague is Professor Barbara Prainsack, if I'm right. And yet again, my plea to press the button. Welcome.
Good morning. It's evening here. I'm joining from Canberra, Australia, where it's very different from Maarja's snowplows, but the effects of climate change are very visible and tangible here. I'm the chair of the European Group on Ethics, and in the next 5 minutes or so, I would like to give you not a comprehensive summary of what the European Group on Ethics statement said, but to highlight a few points that I think are particularly important and complement what my colleagues Tina Gomez and Maarja Kruusma have already said. So I don't need to convince you of the role that values play in policymaking. So every question that we pose in a particular way includes certain values, and the policy instruments that we choose to address problems also reflect certain values rather than others. And politics is, of course, a mediation between different values. So values don't need to be inserted into strategic crisis management. They're already there. And it's we haven't discussed yet the one very, very important element for strategic crisis management to work, which is the ability and the support of citizens to stick with crisis management measures, to comply with them, to support them. And in this context, making values, the values that underpin the instruments that we use to solve problems, the values that underpin our measures, making those values explicit is quite important. This is also what empirical research shows. So obviously in a crisis situation, it's not possible to have a sort of public deliberation on the values that we use to decide whether we go for stricter measures or less strict measures, but making explicit the values that underpin those decisions, next to the scientific evidence, of course, is quite important because it, especially in democracies where it helps to make those values and the decisions or keep them open to scrutiny, and also increase the support of people who can actually support values even if they don't agree with them, if they understand how those decisions were made in the first place. So one value that in our statement we highlight is solidarity. And it's not because we think that solidarity has such a fantastic track record in recent crises. In fact, sometimes it has been mobilized by policymakers, by politicians, to pursue nationalistic goals. And also from empirical research, we know that some people have considered solidarity a stick that was used to beat them. You know, that solidarity was used to demand more and more from people. When authorities, policymakers, institutions were not seen to actually enact solidarity themselves. So one of the big lessons from the previous crises and also from the ongoing pandemic is that solidarity has a lot to offer, but solidarity is something that needs to manifest itself also in institutionalized forms of solidarity. Institutionalized forms of solidarity, such as economic, social, psychological support for people. There's empirical data really that shows that people wanted this. We also know that societies that have those support systems in place, they tend to get through crises better. They are more resilient. So, and I will conclude by adding something to this notion of resilience, which is indeed a very helpful and important notion at the systemic level. So efficiency, in a way, is the enemy of resilience, right? Because you lose the redundancies, you lose the buffer systems that Tina and Maarja also spoke about. But one important way to increase societal resistance is to decrease social inequalities and to, as we say in the report, eradicate poverty. This is not a very sexy message. It's not a new message, but crises really underscore the importance of this as a measure of resilience. And resilience, this is another of our recommendations, and we hope that some of you will look at the statement as well. There are many more recommendations there. Resilience is a helpful notion at the societal level, but it should be used with caution when applied to individuals. In the worst case, because it leads to victim blaming, that citizens feel they are being blamed for things that they cannot really control. You know, they feel that they're told, be more resilient and things will be fine. But it also draws our attention away from the more structural solutions that crises and nested crises that we experience today require. So thanks very much, and I look forward to the discussion, hopefully.
Thank you very much. We are really traveling around the world, also in terms of the climate. Since I had the privilege to be the lead panel member, I would like to start with one or two questions, and then I would like to open the floor to the colleagues. My first question, you had been referring to the complexity of what you refer to in terms of data or studies and so on. My question would be, I mean, since I'm in the Parliament now for 18 years and we started 15 years ago the security research program of the Union, and we have spent so far roughly 5 billion euros on security research. And I well remember that, for example, there had been a study on that the most plausible threat for the Union wouldn't be so much terrorism or that was obvious in terms of the classical security challenge. It was pandemia. And there had been 2 or 3 studies conducted, fairly expensively financed by the program. But in practical terms, we didn't draw any kind of conclusions. Also, what you had been referring to in terms of, let's say, institutionalizing a crisis management system. So Parliament had in the last program in Horizon 2020 a proposal where we could have installed a command and control system which would have the sense of, on the one hand, data processing, but also on visualization. For example, we are financing the satellites of the American AFCOM that's European satellites, and the visualization data and the data processed by these satellites over Africa go to the American Africa High Command, but we can't use them, although we are financing the satellites. So we don't have any kind of visualization or data processing out of our own satellites. We don't have a command and control center, nothing. My question would be a little bit, had you, by your recommendations to the Commission, the impression that the Commission is somehow going back to actually what had been done by almost 5 billion euros on the security research program and the recommendation in terms of crisis management? There are many institutionalized, others. Last example, for example, we had been referring to training. There was the recommendation, there's a study that we need a common training center for the grid in Europe. There is even a center in Germany which can do that with historical data. And the study had been saying we need something like a European training center for conduct crisis management between the member states in terms of some kind of crisis related to the electricity grid. To my knowledge, it never had been taken up. So my question would be a little bit, I mean, what you're recommending from the Commission, how had the Commission that taking up? I mean, you had been doing that studies, it's all wisely, I think, what you had been presenting, but what had been the reaction of the Commission on that? Because do you share the same fate than the almost 5 billion euros we spent on the security research program? Or do you then interact, or do you have any kind of reaction by the Commission, or did they ask you to develop the recommendation any further? So how had that been taken up, what you had been doing? Perhaps we start with Mrs. Gomez. Yeah, we can also collect a question. I think Lina has also a question, and then you can choose whom of you is going to answer, given that the snowblower might come. Lina.
Thanks. Thank you very much for the presentations. You said that there were no such global crises before. I think we have had global crises all over our history. However, probably we were not aware that were so global, or we did not have the information or the framework that we have now, which is good, and definitely. And so I have a couple of questions, because obviously speaking about how global these crises are and how interconnected they are, it is something that we really need to approach globally. But how do you see that now that multi-globalism is not in its best moment? Now that, there is this what we is called the decoupling between US and China, and we are entering in a kind of new globalization, which is a segmented one. So in this framework, in this new international framework, how do you see this needed cooperation towards this global and interconnected crisis? This is the first question. And the second question is, you said, you insisted, and this is the complexity, obviously, and the difficulty, that all these crises are interconnected and they are amplifying among each other. But do you think there is any driver? I mean, there is a crisis that is really the main driver to others, because that also will help us in order to put our efforts and our political efforts as also our regulators. I don't know, do you think climate change or inequality, this social exclusion you were already mentioning, because or is health risk a pandemic? Because the pandemic, we knew it will happen. It is it wasn't the COVID wasn't a black swan. It was a gray swan. We knew it would happen. Probably we didn't know when it will happen and how, but as we know that it will be another one, so that we don't know when and how, but we know it. It's not a black swan, it was a gray swan. So do you think there is two main drivers that could help us to explain and to better approach also from our perspective as legislators this complexity in this interconnected global crisis? Thank you.
I think there's a third question from Mr. Rope.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, the matter is quite extensive, and all of us have different experiences in the area that we are discussing. So maybe we could more exactly define what crisis is. For some, it may be crisis. For others, it may be troubles or worries or difficulties. So first of all, we should agree on how we will define crisis. The financial crisis of 2008, which was quite important, and all the countries reacted. In my country, salaries were cut, pensions were diminished, there were no social benefits, disappeared, taxes were raised. And the explanation for all this was that because of the crisis, we have to do this, and then we will be able to get back to the pre-crisis time. But I remember 2012 and 2013, when nothing was done to catch up with the crisis. I asked one famous professor in Lithuania, so when will this crisis finally end? And the professor answered, this crisis will end when the new crisis starts. So when the pandemic started, we forgot earlier difficulties, earlier crises, and started new activities, new measures. So what I would like to ask about is as follows. How do our guests evaluate? Does the new crisis solve the problems of the old crisis? For government, it may be quite fine that the new crisis comes and promises that have been promised are forgotten. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm looking to the professors, plural, and I think we go along the row. Perhaps Mrs. Gomez starts, and then we go to your colleagues.
Yeah. Thank you. And of course, all very important questions. I start with the fact that, of course, we are all very happy that we are here now, and of course that we hope that our work will have and create impact. That's why we've been doing this. But also, please, we just handed over the report 3 weeks ago, I think, or 4. So we are now in the process of the uptake, and I think Maarja wanted to take more of that, but I definitely don't hope that it will go into a drawer and just sit there. Then, so sort of the issue of global interconnectedness, and of course, I very much agree, global crises are not new, but maybe the plethora of them and the rapidity at which they come at us. And there was then this question about cooperation, and I really very much there would like to go back to what we know about dealing with these complex crises and what is needed to do about them, and what is to really plan cooperations, but also, everything that we do, infrastructure and so forth, plan for resilience. So that means, for instance, make sure that there is diversity, that there is no single one supplier of specific chips, of food, of gas, you name, personal protective equipment, or also that, if you have 3, 4, 5, 10 suppliers, that they don't sit in a single corner of the world. Make sure that there is flexibility in the system, meaning that you can quickly reshuffle and reorganize. Make sure that there is robustness. So I would look at also at cooperations through this angle of the evidence that we have. Then the other 2 points were, one is crises are amplifying each other, but is there a main driver? And that's a bit, that's the unfortunate nature of complexity, that by definition, problems are complex if we can't easily chop them down into pieces. But there is really the need to look at, how specific things interact with each other. So I can't just say, okay, we take out climate change, we solve that, as complicated as it may be, and then all the other crises are solved. And that is because of this complexity. So we've, I think, all mentioned a couple of points that can be helpful in guiding us on dealing with these complex crises, but it will not be possible to just take out one aspect. Rather, it is about focusing. What do we want? What do we want to achieve as a society? How do we want to live going forward? And then look at what conditions may harm this path that we have ahead, and our democracy, how we live together, how we interact, how we want to run our economy, how we want to implement sustainability. So think about that path, and then think about what may harm it, what could disrupt it, and build monitoring systems accordingly. And then the last point, I would say that crisis definitions, we've provided some in the report that may be interesting to look at. But of course, a crisis does not go away if we look away from it. Rather, and that was mentioned in the initial comments, there were warnings of a pandemic, just that if it doesn't mean that if we don't care about it, or that if political attention, the crisis does not go away. On the contrary, it may bite back, come back with a vengeance. That would be my comment on that. Thank you.
Thank you. And now we go to the snowy Baltics.
Still here, waiting for the snow globe. Yes, regarding what has been taken up or how much influence we had. When Professor Tina Coleman started working with the expert, we had 30 European and world's best expert in strategic crisis management in the world. The first reaction was that, why are we here? We've been talking about it for, I don't know, for long already, and we've been writing about it, and why do I have to do it again? And then I was saying, but let's try one more time. Let's put our own messages on a paper and send it to the European Commission and see if they're reacting. And I would say that I'm quite hopeful in that sense. First of all, I don't agree that nothing is done. If that was a message maybe a little bit over exaggerated, I see ERCC to be a good example. As I said, the knowledge hubs for sharing best practices are good examples. GRC has done good work on crisis management and data management. And we didn't only propose a virtual training center. In our opinion, we also proposed a physical training center for training. We really find it to be very important to play through all the coming crises. We had interest from many DGs, but in particular from DG ECHO, to come and talk to them. So I hope it's taking off there, but now I also appeal to the members of STOA, said, please help us to take our messages to the decision makers. Yes, coming to the question whether those entangled crises are new or old, or whether cascading crises before, I've thought a lot about it, and I'm kind of also agreeing with the speaker who said that, but we had crises before, and we had escalating and cascading crises before. I'm completely agree with that. If you look at Europe in 18th century, where we had war, plague, and famine all coming after each other, and amplified by the climate change, by the way, it's a little ice age. So we were completely in a very similar situation. And I think it's a little bit of a tunnel vision of some of us who've had a luxury to live in an unprecedentedly quiet, prosperous and secure times in the whole human history. Even for me, who are coming from a small land up in the north, which is very cold, with an extremely difficult neighbor, I'm still asking, where is the big crisis? So there is a little bit of subjectivity in that. I completely agree on that. But where I think where the crises nowadays are different from the crisis we had before is the many interconnections, complexity and speed at which they are escalating just because of that. And one of the underlying reasons of that is the technology. When we say that we don't know about when the crisis hits and black swans and white swans, I completely agree with that. When we were given the quest to give a scientific opinion, and we had so-called scoping paper, what kind of crisis are we looking for, we were explicitly told, you know what, not to look at military crisis. Yeah, and where are we now? So one of the experts in one workshop said that the best enemy of all the crisis management is a lack of imagination. We just can't think of what kind of crises are going to hit us. And he, by the way, said that the most underestimated types of the crisis is a solar storm. So I don't know whether it's a white swan or a black swan, but me saying it out, it might be now a white swan. But the way scientists look into that unpredictability and uncertainty is that it might sound very scientific, but we look at the crisis as a general crisis. So all crises have something in common. It doesn't matter whether, to some extent, it doesn't matter whether the power grid is off because of shelling, or because of solar storm, or because of the snowstorm. The power grid is off. So we need to know how to live without power for some time, and we need to have quick ways of fixing it, and we need to have resilience thinking, so power grids do not come off that easily, regardless what is the underlying cause of that. And these are also the messages, coming back from the first question, these are also the messages we try to give to all the DGs And I really appealing to you, said, help us to make all the decisions makers to listen to that.
Thank you very much. I have to do something terribly unpolite, but we don't have a snowblower, but we have another study which is to present it today. So I would like to apologize, but also to thank you for the study you have been conducting for the Commission. I think the STOA takes that very seriously. I mean, a lot of members here are members of the research of the ITRE committee. I mean, it had been Parliament granting this amount of money for security research. The sad truth is that a lot of these things had been covered over the last few years. And if you would have spent 5 billion euros to institutionalize crisis management, we probably would have a command and control center, training centers whatsoever, although we are spending more and more money in the analytics, but not so much in the conclusions. Specifically, also I have to skip that now, the discussion on ethics. There had been suggestions also how to cope with the ethical question in times of a pandemic, in the aftermath of SARS. There had been 2 big studies conducted for millions, literally, by DG Home, and it never had been taken up, and especially concerning the question of ethics, we had been then immediately facing with the questions, who is going to get the vaccines in Europe, the countries who are producing the vaccines, or is there, what kind of allocation process is ethical in many ways? And we learned that member states hadn't been acting very ethical when then the Brits, for example, and others had been preferring their own member states in terms of the allocation of that. That is, all that wasn't unknown. All that had been considered in that study, but it had never been taken up. So we don't want to end on a pessimistic standing. I think STOA is going to follow that. We see that conclusions had to be drawn. There's two non-standing committees here in the parliaments concerned with the aftermath of the pandemics and other crises. We take that very seriously. We would like to thank you for your effort, and be aware that the Parliament really had been the driving force in terms of allocating money for crisis management in Europe. The Commission and Member States had been fairly reluctant for the obvious reasons of subsidiarity on the one hand, but simply on not making the Union stronger than they want to have it. We hope that is going to change in the aftermath of recent crises. So thank you very much for your effort, and sorry that we have to shorten the discussion, but we have a second study we have to cope with. So thank you very much to Germany, to the Baltics, and to Australia. Bye-bye. Now I give, without anything, the floor to the two ladies, to Madame Gales Munoz and Patricia Toya on the study of social approach to the transition to smart cities. Please, the floor is yours.
So thank you very much. I will double myself because I think Patricia is not here, so I will take her part too. I think she's not feeling well. So we have the presentation of the outcomes of the study social approach to the transition to smart cities. I'll try to be very brief in the presentation because I know we are running short of time. This study aims to look at the main social challenges involved in the ongoing transition to smart cities and possible ways to address them. It groups identify challenges into 8 categories and identify best practices on how to implement socially responsible and inclusive innovation. Based on an overview of assisted legislation and EU-level initiatives, it proposes a set of 6 policy options at the European Union level to address negative social impacts and promote more inclusive approaches to the smart transition. The speakers will be Agnes Macaluso, who is a senior consultant in EcoIris, where she specializes in the domain of sustainable urban development, urban innovation, and security. She has been coordinating projects and studies in the domain of sustainable urban development, local inclusion, and security. She has vast experience working with municipalities of all sizes across Europe, engaging them through research, policy advice, and technical assistance. And the second author and speaker is Alessandro Gasparotti, who is a consultant at EcoIris, where he specializes, among others, in digitalization, competition, policy evaluation, and regulatory affairs. He is currently working for the European Parliament on a cost of non-Europe in the space sector study, working for DG.com on. And he has also been involved in the implementation of several research projects, such as study for the European Parliament on the future of the European Union automotive sector and an expert fact-finding research on mobile payment across Europe for DG.com, and also a study for DG Regio on the impact of COVID-19, especially on the outermost regions. So there are more. They have their CV is longer than that, but I know we are running short of time, so probably it's the time to ask them to touch the speak button.
Hello, good morning. Thank
Good
you
morning.
very much. Thank you very much for the nice introduction. I hope you can hear me and see me well.
All fine.
Perfect. Well, we are delighted to be here and present the outcomes of my study. I think I can say that also on behalf of my colleague Alessandro and also the rest of the team. Perhaps we can already dive in the second slide so that we can devote more time to the content of the study. So indeed, the study was not just me and Alessandro. There was a much larger team which has implemented it. We are from EcoIris, but we also worked on the study with two partners, IDAT and Fraunhofer. The outcomes of the study, they will be published very soon. There is a final report, but there is also an option brief with policy options that basically outlines 6 key policy recommendations that we have identified as basically key outcomes of our research. We will, of course, touch upon them toward the end of the presentation. And yes, the study was implemented between January and July 2022. Next slide, please. So the main objectives of the study have already been touched upon, but very quickly, I think they are really the 3 objectives and also the 3 steps that we have taken on board. The first one was really to map the evolution of smart city. I mean, smart city is such a broad concept and there are so many different interpretations to it. So we did go through it, but we also really tried to map the different the different types of impact that we can observe on different population groups in cities, but also on different territories. And when I say territory here, I mean typologies of cities and size. We often tend to look only at large, highly digitalized cities. Rural versus urban territories, but also at the same level of cities looking at different neighborhoods. After we've been really identifying main challenges then and risks posed by the transition, we have looked for some best practices across European cities. So projects or initiatives that have been implemented to try to tackle or avoid some of these issues or to promote a more inclusive social transition. This really serve as examples, hopefully for other cities around Europe that can take inspiration from those. But we have also sort of seen what are perhaps the limitations of some of these experiences. We will touch upon that during the presentation. And finally, as I mentioned before, we identify some policy options, but also some key final messages for further reflection and policy action. Next slide, please. Just one very brief comment on the methodological approach that we have used, because we think it's important. Of course, this was a short and small study, but we did combine three main methodologies. One, of course, was desk research. Desk research to really actually see what are emerging trends, but also really map all possible impacts to the transition through looking, of course, at desk research, previous studies, but also mapping the state of play on EU legislation and policy debate and initiatives. The second tool used was really the extensive use of interviews with different stakeholders. We did talk to many representatives from the European Commissions and other European institutions, academics or experts who have dived into this topic, but I would like to stress most importantly city representatives and representatives of associations and networks who could really relate on the real experiences and perspective from the ground. So that was for us very important to really also sort of test and ground our findings and really look at different perspectives of the issues and impacts that we had observed. And finally, but last but not least, we did organize 2 validation sessions with a variety of stakeholders to really test our findings, but also our policy recommendations, including, of course, from the Commission, so to make sure that they made sense and they were grounded and relevant. Next slide, please. So diving a little bit into the content, I know this is a very full slide, but just very quickly to say that, as I was mentioning before, smart city is a very wide and broad concept, and our objective was quite clear. We wanted to really identify social impact of the transition. So how did we do that? What we did as a first step, after, of course, our background and literature review, was to cluster smart city into 5 key components. Those components really allowed us to bring to the ground the implications and impact of smart city transition. So the first one was smart and safe living. Then we had smart governance and e-citizens, smart mobility, smart environment, and finally smart economy. What we did was to take for each of these components specific use cases. What is a use case? A use case is a very practical implication of the smart city transition. So for instance, for the smart safe living, we had to look at, for instance, CCTV web surveillance or, for instance, learning and training online. So very concrete examples. And we picked 5 for each of the components. What we did then, looking at those through desk research and interview, was to identify possible impacts and challenges. Next slide, please. So very quickly here, before I present to you what are actually the main challenges that we have observed, or at least how we have grouped them, a very important reflection to make. We did identify primarily 48 risks across the different use cases. What is interesting, I think, it's 2 things. You can see some of the impact domains listed here: economic, environmental, ethical, political, legal, social, and technological. So the 2 things I wanted to stress is first that, as you can see, a lot of these use cases, some of which are very actually technical, by the way, end up having a very strong social impact on citizens primarily. And the second is that, and we don't have time to show and dive into that, but sometimes you also have secondary effects which might actually impact citizens. So the primary effect might, for instance, only refer to the management of some city services. It could be, for instance, related to cybersecurity and management of the data, but there is a secondary unseen effect also on the citizens. So the implications might be broader and often overlooked. Next slide, please. So what we have done, we've looked at all these risks identified, and we have really tried to cluster them. This has then become the framework also for us to develop best practices and also the policy recommendations. We could talk hours about this, but I'll just try now to run through them quickly for your benefit. So the first, let's say, cluster is privacy, surveillance, cybersecurity, and safety aspects. And these, by the way, are very relevant for city at the city administration level, but then also, of course, at different levels for the citizens and community groups. Data loss inaccuracy, lack of reliability, and interoperability issues. And here again, we have a lot of secondary implications. For instance, think about health-related decisions, how they might actually affect the security and safety of patients. So it's not just a technological and data issue, but the implication might be much, much broader. Digital inequality and exclusion, I think that's quite self-explanatory and certainly one of the largest groups. And again, to stress here, we are not just thinking about inequality related to, for instance, age or digital literacy, but also where does, for instance, a citizen live? Because depending on where you live in the city, you might have very different access to services or quality of services. And financial burden for authorities and service providers. So that's not just related to the fact that digital innovation, ICT have a cost and not all cities, municipalities could afford that. Let's think about a variety of city size, but also the broader spectrum of European cities. But I think a very important issue that was faced here was also the difficulty to retain qualified staff, able to actually enforce digital transition in public administrations, because there is a big, let's say, diaspora effect toward private employers, and this seems to be for many cities one of the biggest issues, which also impact, of course, capacity and competencies. Then economic damage and inequalities. Think about the effect of e-commerce on small businesses, but also sometimes the labor conditions of those working for e-commerce or other similar platforms. And then lack of trust and approval in the service and service provider. I think that was one of the most interesting one. And this is very spread. Also in countries where the digitalization and the transition has been going on for many, many years. So it's not just a sort of speed effect also caused by the pandemic, as it has been actually in many of our realities. We can go back to that. You see also on the bottom two more cross-cutting, which are very much affecting the different domains, so they are less thematic specific. One is the loss of human contact, isolation through remote care work, training and shopping. I think we mostly all can relate to that, and we can really also have experienced that through the restrictions of COVID, but this is really affecting many aspects of life. As you can see, it's not just related to one. And then I would just spend a few words on the other one, which I think is very important: the potential dependency on private technology providers and vendor lock-in. So the fact that many services and the provision of also sometimes essential services are actually in the hand of private owners and providers. And of course, they tend to follow, private market logic. So this means that, for instance, the provision of some services in an area where there is less demand, it's less encouraged. This is, of course, a risk, especially when there is also the ownership of the data. And this is also linked to the issue of trust that I was mentioning before. Because, of course, trust is also sometimes damaged by the fact that the impression is that, of course, the management and the provision of the services is not only drawn by public interest. I will leave it up for now, and I will pass the floor to Alessandro, who will dive into, the best practices that we have identified in relation to these challenges.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for your invitation to today's meeting. Moving on from where Agnese left her presentation, I would ask you to move to the next slide, first of all. And here we present, as the second task of our study, we've been identifying best practices. And we start with a definition of what we consider best practice in this study, and we define it as an action or an activity that has been implemented by at least one city to tackle one of the specific risk groups and challenges that have been identified and presented a minute ago. In doing so, we shortlisted the most promising cases that we identified, which resulted in a list of 27 different best practices. Our initial mapping and selection, of course, could rely on a vast amount of different available examples from cities across Europe and across the rest of the world. And in order to select what we found most promising, we followed the following criteria, which included whether the best practices facilitated the mitigation or the prevention of at least one of the macro challenges identified in the study, whether there is a demonstrated effectiveness of the best practices, meaning whether there is a corresponding documentation to validate the insight and the success of the practice itself, whether the best practices allowed for the inclusion of at least one group of citizens at risk, which we defined either as children, adults, elderly, or migrants and foreign population, for example. We also investigated the affordability of the best practices itself, the potential for replicability, and we tried not to focus on technology per se, but on the broader implication for society. We categorized 27 of them. We have in the study a few examples that have been further detailed. You can see in this slide there is one of them on digital inclusion for women in Ireland, which entailed providing work placement and training for women and adolescent girls into STEM professions. This was funded by companies that decided to adhere to the trial period themselves to facilitate their inclusion and their involvement into a field of profession that is normally where women are normally underrepresented. And this is just one of the 27 examples. I would ask you to move to the next slide, please. From this one best practice and from the 27 that we assessed, we managed to draw some general observations that guided us in then the development of policy option. And these observations include the fact that the budget needed for best practices can vary substantially depending on the investment readiness or willingness. We analyze best practices in which the budget could range between a few thousand euros, for example, for providing laptops to public libraries, to best practices that entailed at least 1 million euros of investment. What we notice is that many of the best practices are financed through public funding. Only few of them rely on private capital. One of the examples is the one presented in the previous slide. Most of the best practices are not applied on a large scale, but remain on the level of trials and short-term initiative, which is something that is partially encouraged or a consequence of public funding into research and innovation, for which after the trial period funding dries up and there is not a possibility to scale up a successful project, which also lead us to the fact that scaling up replicability and the adaptability of a best practice to a different case are open question. This is also due to the fact that in most cases there is a limited scope in terms of the population and the stakeholders that are targeted during the trial phase. And finally, and very importantly, it's a very interesting finding from our studies that there is not a well-defined set of evaluation criteria, and there is a limited monitoring when even there is monitoring of the impact of the best practice in the longer term, as in most cases we see that there are a set of metrics and criteria that are used for evaluation that are basically filled using the information that are available as an observable result of the experiment, so without considering the long-term implication. Moving on to the next slide, please. From the finding of desk research, our understanding of risk, categories, macro challenges, and our assessment of best practices, we then moved into the, we now move to the presentation of policy option. We started with a list of 15 potential options that we, as a research team, came across during desk research during engagement with stakeholders and the lesson learned from the mapping of best practices. And we decided to narrow down to 6 of those initial 15 policy options based on the 3 criteria that are presented in the slide, meaning, first of all, whether there is a possibility for policymakers at the EU level to act, and this is often due to the tension between the focus of the urban level and the tailoring of policy options for EU policymakers. We then look into the extent to which the policy option build upon and can integrate existing policy framework and EU objectives, starting from the fact that smart cities are a very broad and over-encompassing concept. We acknowledge that there are a lot of different legislation that directly or indirectly tackle the social aspect related to the transition. So we try to focus on complementing what is already existing, strengthening existing program, and supporting synergies instead of trying to reinvent the wheel. And finally, we also assessed whether the proposed policy option add EU added value and whether its delivery is realistic, which means we focused on policy option for which the benefit of acting at the EU level is clear, and for which the timescale of implementation and the cost can be considered realistic and therefore worth exploring further. Next slide, please. Here is the list of the 6 policy options. All of them are explained in detail in the option brief and even more so in the final study. The 6 we decided to present as a final result of our research include setting up a body for certification and the quality assurance of digital infrastructure in cities, strengthening the role of national contact points to further and better link EU and national realities and support capitalization and upscale. We propose the setting up of help desk for less digitalized city. We also suggest to reinforce capacity building of public administrations to strengthen digital skills, as it has been recognized also throughout this presentation as one of the key difficulties for public administrations. We propose to further develop and further conduct research and gather further evidence on the benefit and cost that are associated with remote working and service provision in cities. Since the pandemic, we are experiencing a reorganization of cities around remote working, and different understanding of how services are provided at the local level and even more importantly within different neighborhoods. And finally, we propose to create a knowledge platform for best practices to support replicability and the scale up of smart city solutions. For a lack of time, we will not discuss all of them right now. You can find all the information in the final study and the policy brief. We will present more in detail 3 of them, so if you could move to the next slide, please. And once more, next slide. We will present as policy option number 2 on strengthening the role of national contact points, as we see the value of this in helping raising awareness, especially among smaller cities, about initiative and opportunities that exist at the EU level, but might not be easily to find or to gather information about for smaller communities, and also as a possibility for picking up and promoting practices, solutions and ideas from the local level, thus facilitating both top-down and bottom-up sharing of best practices and innovative solutions. The role of national contact points could be particularly important in bringing to light grassroots initiatives from either local groups or even individuals that have proven valuable at the local level and deserve to be promoted and shared across the member state and between member states across the EU. One of the key strengths of national contact point is that would support local community in their own native language and thus eliminating linguistic barriers, which would help provide information across programs that could facilitate the involvement of all EU territories, thus reducing the exclusions and inequalities of smaller cities and peripheral areas of the EU. I would suggest we move this to the next slide, and then to the next slide again, so to policy option number 4, where, as my colleague Agnese already discussed, one of the big difficulties of local administration is the administrative burden and the retaining of qualified expertise. We are aware and we complement the existing instruments that already have been put in place, such as the joint assistance to support projects in European region, JASPER programs, and they have proven valuable in supporting local authorities in implementing smart projects. But often those external advices and traditional technical assistance support is not per se sufficient in creating lasting competencies, such as organizational changes, new learning methods and mechanisms to attract and retain qualified staffs. So in addition to what exists, in some cases, we also noted that a single city cannot tackle a problem on its own, as there might be necessity for synergetic action across more cities. This is a good example of this could be in the deployment of digital solutions in the domain of air quality, water management, or traffic control, where a neighboring community could act together to further benefit from the deployment of smarter technologies. And for that reason, we proposed inclusion in technical assistance programs of more trainings of local public administration and to further strengthen peer-to-peer exchanges. One way of doing that could be expanding the Erasmus Plus for staffers of public administration, such as a practice that already exists, for example, in the medical profession to facilitate learning in different environments and to specialize in different niche aspects of the transition towards smart cities. In order to be successful, of course, we realized that such scheme would need to provide clear incentives to the administration and staff members to join the program. So we proposed further details the creation of a seal of excellence for public administration that partake in such training programs, which could also help then citizens to trust the deployment of technologies more. And suggest we move to the next slide, please. And once more to a policy option number 6, in which we present and we propose the creation of a knowledge platform for best practices to support replicability and the scale-up of inclusive smart city solution. Our idea is not only to create a repository, but a laboratory for testing and knowledge capitalization. The idea would be to develop a platform that could include best practices and relevant information for replicability, also coming from other existing repositories, such as the one that the GRTD yearly produces, called the Mapping Repository, the repository that exists within the EU Mission Knowledge Portfolio, as well as those of the Urban Agenda, URBACT, or the Joint Research Center. So the idea would be to provide a repository and a laboratory where aggregation takes place. Such platform that we propose could be advertised by the national contact points that we discussed in policy option number 2 to further increase the awareness of best practicing existing across the EU. And it should gather and broker knowledge collected across different EU-funded projects and locally funded activities, so to capitalize on the knowledge gathering that is taking place in a dispersed way at the moment. what we propose is that this platform could also be then used not only by local communities when they are interested in implementing the solution, but also by citizens themselves to understand the possible implication of a best practice or possible solution that could tackle a problem that is perceived at a local community, in a specific neighborhood, or in a limited territorial area. So also increase the bottom-up possibilities for citizens to have a say and to understand what technology can do to support the transition. And with this, I would then move to the next slide and give the floor back to my colleague Agnese for a few concluding remarks.
Yes, thank you, Alessandro. And I don't see the slide anymore, but I think I can still present it. Okay, thank you very much. So just a few final considerations. These go really beyond the policy options and have been captured through the review of the different impacts and best practices and the challenges, especially and opportunities the cities see. So the first one is really that the networks and the programs that promote this exchange of knowledge and information are extremely appreciated. I mean, some of these programs like Urbact, like Regio TAIEX peer-to-peer, I mean, the cities that have had a chance to participate, they do see that they really offer a great added value. Sometimes programs like Urban Agenda, they do not provide financial support. That's a problem. Those that do really represent our resources. So one of really the recommendation is to continue to invest on those and really also expand the participation to these great experiences, because there's so many lessons around Europe that we do not have to reinvent the wheel. This of course links to the second issue, which is the involvement of medium and small cities. That's of course one of the top priorities. I mean, we see that also now in cohesion policy, but more and more could be done. One of the issues, of course, is the capacity, the resources that are limited, but also the language barrier, which really remains an issue. Of course, national contact points can do a lot in that respect. Perhaps something that we can do more is support not just pan-European programs, but also programs at the national level that really sort of help also transfer the knowledge from cities who might have had the possibility to participate, for instance, in EU programs and research into, smaller cities that perhaps didn't have that opportunity. One other point, which is, I think, important, one of the questions also posed by the study at the beginning was, are actually citizens real protagonists of the transition? We did really think about that and sort of discussed it also with a number of stakeholders, and our finding there is not yet. But perhaps also that's not time yet for this, in the sense that the priority for us, it's really to tackle the really big inequalities that are still in place in terms of the digital skill gap, but also the access to quality services. That should really be the policy priority, and of course then incentivizing an active participation of the citizens to the transition, as some programs are doing, like let's think about the Bauhaus initiative, for instance, or the new missions that have been launched by the Commission. They do provide citizens a sort of more protagonist role. So we are heading there, but there's still quite some work to do. And finally, just a note on a sort of guiding principle we would like to really see promoted more, as in the green transition, we have the just transition concept. We do think that this should also apply to the smart one. So really having this approach that is holistic, that looks at the different domains and really puts the fact of not leaving anybody behind in terms of individuals, but also communities and cities really at the forefront. And with that, I'd like to thank you very much for your attention. And of course, we're happy to answer any questions you might have.
Yeah, so thank you very much for such an interesting study and presentation, especially because you also include not only the best practices, this knowledge sharing, but also very important for us, the policy options. I would like to make a couple of comments and questions. I'll try to be very brief. It is, especially from the point of view of what we could do or not. I mean, it's obviously that wherever inclusion we are dealing with in MASPAS through infrastructure, literacy, and this is something we could promote from here, obviously, with member states. But there are also some issues that could be very limiting depending on the different cities. For instance, the financial burden, not only because the availability of money, because it's also sometimes that there are rules within member states, fiscal rules that really some is mainly local authorities that cannot go beyond certain budget, and that could limit it enormously all the transformation cities need to follow. And also regarding this participation, this inclusion that is essential, have you seen or studied the tool of the public procurement and how important it is to changes toward the goals of for smart cities, because sometimes that could also help to develop local or regional capabilities, because sometimes this all this technology could come from abroad, but if you have no capabilities really within those cities, that will very different. Also, I have a specific question on the best practice you presented, the one on Ireland, on the digital inclusion of girls and women, that obviously this is not a group, just the majority of the population, so it's good that we make things to include them, to include us. But I'm wondering to what extent this there is replicability in this best practice and the possibility of scale up, because you mentioned it was the private sector which financed. But there is not a reality in many places. For instance, there are many cities that are driven by the service sector, very low wages, and I don't know, these companies really finance this sort of program. So I don't know to what extent this is really a replicable city, because this is kind of obviously that also leads us to this snowball effect. The smartest cities are the one that knows how good it is to be smart. So this is, sometimes these not very big cities need to do a really huge effort in order to be there. Just, well, thank you very much. And I am here because I'm really looking forward to go to one of the cities that has been chosen among the 100, to the mission of the 100 smart and sustainable cities for Horizon Europe mission program, and also has been chosen the capital of European smart tourism, which is my hometown, Seville, which is doing a big effort, but always obviously funded this problem of local capacities, and also these legal limits regarding financial burden in order to really make the transformation that is needed. So thank you very much. And Maria?
Thank you very much. We have no time to a big discussion. It's a pity. It's so interesting. So many questions I would like to raise, considering all the presentations. So I'm going to be very brief, and I don't expect you are going to answer me. These not questions, are remarks. The first one is about gender impact of smart cities, something I don't see, I haven't seen explained. The other one is about digital assisted best practice in order to solve or in a transition period the problem of the lack of digital skills. And the other one, the most important one probably, is about best practice on cooperation between cities, considering the costs to develop some of the solutions and the importance of interoperability between different cities in order to share data about different kinds of innovations and good practices. I know you cannot answer me about these remarks, but think about that, and we can keeping this discussion on this important topic for all of us, not only from a technological point of view, but also to improve work-life balance. That is a very important issue in our life. Thank you very much.
So perhaps a short reply, because we are then missing a translation, and since I see the Christmas nervousness, and rightly so, by our translators, I would like, before we get the answers, because we can stay in English, I think, I would like to thank you, the translators, to do so. I do know that STOA topics are complex, and specifically for that, I would like to thank you for all the efforts accompanying the work of STOA. I think it's sometimes really a challenge, might be sometimes also interesting for translation, but it leaves us to wish you a Merry Christmas. Thank you for all the efforts and contributions to our work. We are going to stay in English, and I would like you to have a happy Christmas and a happy New Year, and I see your faces, which are helping our work and are indispensable for our work next year. Bye-bye. And with that, I give the floor to our experts.
Thank you very much also for the very interesting questions and indeed reflections that we will retain. So perhaps I may start, and then Alessandro, you can jump in on some of the points raised. On the financial burden, that's a really valid point. And of course, I mean, the study was looking at recommendation for the EU institutions, but it's clear that some of the issues have to be tackled at the local level, and looking at cities, administrations, and also, institutional setup, there are very important differences. So what can be done actually in that respect? I think one of the couple of things I'd like to flag is that one very important lesson we've seen, for instance, from cities like Vienna, is that if there is a centralized smart city strategy with a clear contact point and really one person who's also dealing with all the providers, that really provides and makes a difference. This is something, of course, that has to happen locally, but perhaps also a sort of message at the EU level can be conveyed on how valuable and how actually effective have been some of the experiences across European cities that have sort of adopted a more consistent governance in that respect. Another thing which would be interesting to touch upon in relation to the other question on how to actually build capabilities in cities, and also relates to the governance, is that we have seen in places like, for instance, the region of Alentejo, where, of course, there is an issue related to the capacity, the resources, the human resources when it comes to smart city transition. Uniting forces can be very beneficial. So really working across municipalities, sharing expertise, and perhaps also staff members where that becomes a big issue, could be a solution, and a very effective one. And there are also some EU-funded cross-border cooperation programs that look at these possibilities. So also looking beyond cities and really small towns, this could be an interesting, I think, horizon. The point of gender, yes, it was not really one of our sort of target groups for this study, but it's an important one. The groups where we saw most differences were not actually linked to gender, but more social extraction and age, and where they actually lived in the city, but definitely something to further research. And then on the cost of exchanges of the practices and interoperability, that's definitely true. But there are many, many things, especially in the design part and the strategic part, and also in the governance setup of smart city projects, that can be actually exchanged and very limited costs. And this is why we really reinforce the importance of programs that stimulate those changes. One of the best practices was on our help desk to support cities with that. So that could be also a sort of centralized body at European level. Of course, language remains a priority, but definitely some reflections to continue to work on. And perhaps, Alessandro, you want to respond on the best practice related question, and if you want to add anything on this.
Yes, thank you, Agnese. Well, thank you for the very interesting question. There's a lot of reflection that still needs to happen. So a lot of research will still need to take place. But going to the question regarding the best practice itself on the digital inclusion for women in Ireland, we understand indeed that we assessed it as a best practice that is extremely easy to replicate, because there does not need to be a specific adjustment for it to be introduced by companies in different cities. In this specific case, it was already implemented across the entirety of Ireland, so multiple cities took part in this exercise. Sponsoring could come from companies that will, in most cases, also see the benefit of expanding their pool of possible candidates and expanding the workforce in a field that is requiring more and more personnel to be trained. So we understand that the problem is, of course, based on only cities that are smart will want to push for such training scheme or such awareness campaign. And the money will have to come from companies that have a foresight understanding of the benefit that they can make out of it. But apart from this key aspect, we consider that as a very clear example of something that once made aware of, it could be easily replicated and implemented across the continent. And whereas going back to other questions, such as development of local capabilities via possibly public procurement, or the importance of interoperability to reduce cost, this is something that we indeed identify as key throughout the study. It's something that we assess in a few best practices, and is one of the focal points of the recommendations as well. There's a lot of open standards that has been developed. We propose the creation of this knowledge platform for best practices, which should also facilitate the adoption of common standards to further facilitate in the future interoperability between cities, and also streamline and facilitate replicability of already introduced solution and best practices, therefore reducing the cost of initiating this transition for cities that might be lagging behind, which would also partially address the fiscal limitation that cities across the EU might have because of their administrative regulation or their relation with region or national governments. So there is indeed, we see all the questions that you raise as extremely interesting, and in a sense, there is a lot of interconnectedness between them, and it's something that we tried to implement across the board with the proposed policy option that we suggest. And well, I hope this is a good enough of an answer for now, and for the rest we will continue happily to research this fascinating and ever-changing topic.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank Madame Macaluso and Mr. Gasparotti. That would then, in formal terms, lead to the fact that if there are not any objections by the plenary, the study is taken. We would like to thank the experts for the presentation. I think it had been a valuable and will be a valuable contribution to an ongoing discussion of an instrument as the smart cities, but in more general terms, how to get that into practical reality. So in formal terms, the study will be published on the STOA website and widely distributed within and outside the Parliament. I thank Mrs. Calvo-Simunos and Mrs. Toya for sponsoring the study. And that leaves me here to refer that the next STOA panel is taking place on Thursday, the 19th of January in the next year in Strasbourg, remotely via Interactio. And we will feature the presentation of the outcomes of the study, Artificial Intelligence in the agri-food sectors, applications, risks, and impacts, and leaves me to the numbers and hundreds of colleagues to wish them a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. And we're going to see us next year. Thank you very much.